Okay, hello everybody. It is 4 o'clock Central Time and time for us to get started. I want to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. This is Betsy Hill, President of Brainware Learning Company, and we're delighted you're all here. Our housekeeping notes are as usual that we are recording the webinar so that you can watch it later, or you can share the link with colleagues who may not have been available to attend at this time. Please type any questions in the chat window or the Q&A area. Either one will do. You can download a copy of the slides. I've pasted a copy of the link, and perhaps Karen can repaste it if there's somebody who's joined us in the last few minutes. They may not have seen the original little chat post. If you have requested a certificate of participation, we will take care of that automatically when we get the attendance from the webinar, and so that will go out. You should expect to get that within a week or so. So let's get started. This is a little different from our other demos that we've been doing yesterday and today because demonstrating professional development is a little bit different. Doing a demo of it I decided would be sort of like demonstrating a shower. You might get the idea, but you won't get wet. So I would rather that everybody gets a little wet. So what I'm going to do is actually go through, provide some of the information activities, just as we do it in one of our workshops and our other trainings. We're going to do just a piece of it, but hopefully it will give you a good flavor, and hopefully we will make this as interactive as possible. So what I want to do is start with, a basic question that we all probably don't think about maybe as much as we should. We talk about learning all the time. We talk about teaching and learning. We talk about student learning. And so it really sort of begs the question what learning is. So what I would like you to do is to just take a moment and type into the chat window how you would define learning. So when you think about learning, what does that mean to you? And I'll give everybody a moment to share their thoughts. I'm going to try and take a little peek here. Putting together ideas, words, or images that you didn't understand before. Very nice. You also can see, typically what I hear are mastering skills, gaining knowledge, acquiring knowledge and skills that you haven't had before. Often I hear teachers and others talk about demonstrating the knowledge, being able to actually use it in practice. And all of those things are important and very relevant. But when I think about learning and the kind of work that we do, we remind ourselves that learning is truly a biological process. So we spend a lot of time in schools and other learning situations looking at the content and the skills and outcomes and how we can tell whether somebody has learned something. But the process is truly a biological one. It's actually the creating and strengthening of connections among neurons in our brain. The brain is a learning machine. It builds itself through experience, through interaction with the world. And it creates and strengthens the connections that are useful and used in groups or maps of neural networks that are activated together. So when we see or hear something, as we do in any learning experience, a network of neurons is activated. When a group of neurons has activated together before, it is more likely that activating one or more of those neurons will cause that whole network to activate. And the more we activate that group of neurons, the stronger that tendency is. And that is the principle that neuroscientists refer to when they say neurons that fire together wire together. When we remember something, then, we don't go to a storage vault and pull it out. It doesn't sit somewhere as different in our brains. What we're actually doing in the process of remembering is reactivating or reconstructing the connections that we made at the time that the learning happened, or as it may have been modified over time as we have reactivated it over and over again. In a very real sense, our brains become what our brains do. So our job as parents and teachers is to help our students' brains build strong connections for the information and skills so that it is easier to reactivate it when they need to later. Certainly for when the test comes up, but ideally for a much, much longer time than that. So this is where we need to jump down just for a few minutes to the cellular level and take a look at neurons and how they communicate. This is a diagram of 3 neurons. Each neuron has a nucleus, represented by that little black circle in the middle, and 1 axon. The axon is the part of the neuron that carries electrical and chemical messages from that neuron to other neurons. The dendrites are the parts of the neurons that receive the messages. And each neuron has approximately 6,000 dendrites, but just 1 axon. Dendrite comes from the Greek word for tree, and the dendrites are like the neuron's branches, reaching out to receive information from the axons of the other nerve cells. So dendrites cover most of the cell surface. And of course, this is a picture of 3 of them, but our brains contain about 85 billion neurons. And when they connect, after that signal goes down the axon, it gets to the space between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another. And that is called the synapse. That is where the electrical signal generates the release of chemicals that are called neurotransmitters, you've probably heard that term, into the synapse. And then it's picked up at the other end by the other neuron. And that is how neurons communicate with each other. The neurons linking to each other is really the basis for all human behavior. And these communications or signals that transfer from communicate from one neuron to the next happen about 1,000 times a second. So the brain is a very, very, very busy place. But we can see how these neurons connect, and you can just imagine that all of the possible connections with all of those dendrites across neurons make a very dense network of connections. So this is a slide of what neurons actually look like in the brain. Of course, this is enlarged many times. 30,000 neurons would fit on the head of a pin. And you can see all the little cell bodies, and then you can see all those little stringy kinds of things, which are the connections between those neurons. And what you're actually seeing here is you can almost see lines that go across. Those are the layers of the cortex, the outside part of the brain. So when you see a picture of a brain and it has all that sort of wrinkled, covered stuff, that is actually the cortex. And there are 6 layers in the cortex, which connect up and down and, of course, across throughout those layers. So imagine each of these neurons activating, transmitting signals over and over again. Some of them activate other neurons, some of them calm other neurons. So very, very busy place. But your brain didn't start off with all these connections or synapses. So here are 2 more images of brain tissue from the cortex. The one on the left is of a newborn, and the one on the right is from the brain of a 2-year-old. So we are born with just about all of the neurons we are ever going to have. At birth, the brain has about 85 billion neurons. Sometimes you will read it's between 100 and 150 billion, but the current evidence suggests that it's closer to around 85 billion. Now, there's still trillions and trillions of connections, and so that we don't need to worry about it not being 100 billion, that's for sure. At birth, the brain weighs about a pound. The adult brain weighs about 3 pounds. And so it's going to increase and grow quite significantly from that time. From the time the first neurons are created in utero up to age 2, each neuron in the cortex creates about 1.8 synapses per second. Just so think about how quickly that happens. Each neuron. By 1 year, the brain has doubled in size. By the age of 5 or 6, it's 90% of its adult size and weight, which is why little children seem to have such big heads, because that brain is growing like crazy. Remember, though, that this does not mean that the brain is producing more neurons. In fact, it's not. All of that growth is the result of the creation of trillions and trillions of connections among those billions of neurons. And this creation of connections, it's what our brains do as we interact with environment. So this is a true picture of learning. What has happened from the newborn to the age of 2, that is actually the creation of networks within the brain. And these are the networks that help us see and hear and talk and walk, create a work of art, write a novel, solve a math problem, teach, everything that we do. And so I love this because it's such a graphical representation. Now, one of the things that I find very interesting is that the 2-year-old brain, this image that you're seeing here, actually has too many connections. So our brains are busy creating these connections for all the situations that we experience. But some of those learnings, some of those experiences are more important than others. Some of them, these networks are very reliable, very important, and so they get stronger. Though the weaker connections now are going to be pruned, and so some of those synapses are going to be sort of erased, gotten rid of by the brain because there's simply too many of them. And in fact, when we think of the terrible twos, this is maybe also a picture of the terrible twos as well as a picture of learning. So what I want to talk about next is we want to jump back to sort of how does information get in and how does it create these memories. So this is a model of cognitive processing that we sometimes use. Information, as we know, comes in through our senses, our eyes and our ears and our taste buds, turn information into electrical signals, and that activates neural networks in our brains. Most of the information that we are exposed to is simply discarded. We can only take in a very small part of that incoming information. And so our brains have to decide instantaneously what's important, and then they just drop the rest of it so that you can see the information coming into receptors, being held onto for a very brief time in sensory memory. And then if our brains decide that we need to do something more with it, we might keep it, but otherwise it's just discarded. If it is something that gets through our attention and that we take in and start to work with, we do that in working memory. Working memory is a little like a work table where we set out all the information we need to work on. And some of it may be incoming information, some of it may be information that we retrieve from long-term memory. So I sometimes think about it, I use the analogy of preparing a recipe. So let's say I've just gone to the grocery store and I've gotten some fresh ingredients that I'm going to use to make whatever dish it is. And then I go to those, so that's the incoming new information. And then I go to my pantry and I get some staples, maybe it's flour and sugar and salt or whatever, and olive oil, and those come out of long-term memory. That's my storage pantry. And then on that working table and working memory, we assemble all those things. We think about it, we process it, and we actually change and reinforce it. We have to process new information and connect it to what we already know in working memory, or again, that information won't be stored. You can see that arrow going down out of working memory. So if we don't process it in working memory, it has no hope of making it to long-term memory. So now I want to look a little bit at some of these processes. I want to take a look and start with this process that gets, it's sort of the filter between sensory memory and working memory, and that is our attention processes. And of course, as teachers, we're always interested in attention. We know that our students are not always as good at it as they could be. So I'm going to ask you to think about what you're paying attention to right now. And then it may or may not be me, and it's okay. We are always paying attention to something. It may not always be exactly what the teacher intends us to be paying attention to. And that's a very familiar situation for most educators. But what I want to do is I want to share a little video with you. The URL for this is available on that slide. So if you download a copy of the slides, you could be able to find this. And this is called the monkey business illusion. So I'm going to go ahead and play it.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it, but did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion.
So we're going to close that down. So I would love it if we were actually in face-to-face in a classroom now, because I typically get all kinds of wonderful reactions at this point. Some people have never seen the original video of the monkey business illusion, and again, half of them notice the monkey, the gorilla, and some of them don't. But for those of you like me that were familiar with this, when I first came across this, it surprised me too. And so I didn't notice the curtain changing color, and I didn't notice the player leaving the team, but I sure was aware of that gorilla. And I also was able to count 16 passes. So I had made progress, but it just points out that we don't always know exactly what we're paying attention to. And unless, the real lesson here is that unless we focus our students' attention, they may not be paying attention to they may not be seeing or getting what it is that we want them to see and get. And sometimes you have to be more explicit than you think. It's not just pay attention now to what I'm doing, but pay attention to the prepositional phrase I'm going to use, or pay attention to the first step I take in solving this problem, because then we have a much greater likelihood of getting our students to actually get it through that initial filter and be with us on the same page when it gets to working memory. So after we get that into working memory, I want to talk a little bit more about working memory. It's really where we store all of the information that we need to think about to solve a particular problem. the amount of information we can hold is, in general, correlated with general intelligence and is a good predictor of the ability to learn and solve problems. In some of the earlier webinars, yesterday and today, I've talked about the high level of correlation between working memory and reading comprehension, between working memory and problem solving in math. And in fact, it's a good predictor of all kinds of other capacities for accomplishment, whether it's academically or in life. So it's plays a really important role. And one of the most important jobs it has is to help us practice things. So when we keep it activated, we're keeping information activated, we're keeping it alive. So if we're reading, for example, and we're trying to comprehend something, that's working memory is where we're thinking about all that. So the more that we actively rehearse it there, the more likely it's actually going to get into long-term memory and be there for us the next time when we want to reactivate it. So I want to give you a little working memory experience now, just as an example. So what I'd like you to do is to think about how many windows you have in your house. So I'll give you a moment just to think about that. And I'm thinking about mine. Okay. So hopefully you've had a chance to count them, but if you live in a really big house, you may still be counting. And how did you come up with that? How did you figure it out? And feel free to share anything in the chat window about the process you used. So typically, what we hear is that you visualize yourself walking from one room to the other, or standing at the door of each room and looking in. Judy shared with us that she had to decide if windows and doors counted. So I don't happen to have any windows indoors in my house. So then she visualized, okay. So that's the process. So, and we have to, while we're doing that, we're seeing one room, counting the windows in that, then seeing the windows in the other room and counting the windows in that, adding them together and holding on to that number. That's what we do in working memory. It's a great example of it. And of course, the connection with our ability to visualize and keep that picture active in our brains is also really helpful. So now let's talk a little bit about what it means when we say that neurons work together in networks. In this set of images from a PET scan, we can see which parts of the brain are more active than others. So the areas colored in white, red, or yellow show greater activity. So those neurons are talking to each other and sending signals all over the place. And the areas of less activity show up in green and blue and purple. The white is just an outline. It's drawn in here. And we're looking at the brain from the side. The front part of the brain is on the left and the back part of the brain is on the right. So what do we see here? I do want to mention one other thing actually before I go on, which is that the black parts, it looks like nothing is going on. And that doesn't mean that the neurons are completely inactive. All it means is that they are less active. So these are degrees of activity. So sometimes people are inclined to say, well, we don't really use all our brains, or the rest of the brains are not doing anything. It's really important to understand the meaning of images like this, which is we're just looking at the most active, the ones where the activity is distinguished when we're conducting a certain activity or we're doing a certain task. So what we see here are groups of hundreds and thousands or millions of neurons communicating with each other. The activity causes the images to appear brighter. And so we can see here what area of the brain is active when we're reading, just looking at words. And that's in the back part of our brain. That makes sense. That's our occipital lobes. And we know that that is where visual processing takes place. When we're listening to words, we're seeing the side of the brain area here, and that's the temporal lobe where auditory processing occurs. When we're speaking words, we see this little strip at the back of the frontal lobe, which is called the motor cortex. And this is where all of the motor coordination happens in our brains. We control all of our movement. And then you can see when we're generating verbs that we have a couple different parts of our brain lit up. When I talk about generating verbs, the idea here is that you're given a noun. Let's say we give you the word broom, and you have to come up with a word that's associated with it. So you might say sweep. And it turns out that these two parts of our brain are really important in language, and they're going to turn out to be pretty important in reading as well. So that's what we mean when neural networks get together. Now, I want to dig a little bit deeper into one of these parts of the brains because it really helps us understand sort of how we initially learned about this. Brain scans have only been available fairly recently. Until the advent of that, it was from anatomy, from people who died and had injuries, and scientists and researchers examined their brains. So this is an example of that. It was from a young man named Tan. And you can see on the side of this, the area that was affected. But this is the story of how this all happened. Paul Broca was a French neuroscientist in the 19th century, so the 1800s, quite some time ago. And he studied a disorder called aphasia, difficulty producing speech. And one day they brought a young man to see him, whose name was Tan. And he was named Tan because that was the only word that he could say. So whatever question, whatever, he just would respond Tan. When Dr. Broca interviewed him, it was clear to him that Tan understood everything that he was saying. But when he tried to answer, the only sound, the only word that he could produce was Tan. Unfortunately, this young man died not too long after that. But on the fortunate side of things, Dr. Broca was allowed to autopsy his brain, and this is what he found. It's this picture. So either some trauma or a stroke or something like that had killed a large number of brain cells on the left side near the front of Tan's brain. And so Broca thought, well, I wonder if this has something to do with his aphasia, his inability to speak. And he examined the brains of other patients with this type of aphasia, and he found similar injuries. So today we call this Broca's area, and it's one of the major areas of the brain responsible for our ability to produce speech, which is why when we see that lit up area, when we're generating verbs, that's exactly what's going on. That rear area that's also lit up was named after a researcher named Wernicke. And so if you're interested in doing that, we sometimes talk about that, especially when we talk about PD around the reading brain. So we've talked about a bunch of stuff here, and this is something that I can't simulate exactly the way that we would do it in a live face-to-face setting. So I'm going to ask you to imagine it. What I do at this point is I ask the participants to pair up to decide who is A and B. And then I ask them to pretend that B has just arrived and A's job is to explain to B what she or he has missed. When I do this online, what I typically will ask you to do is to jot down some of the things that you've just heard, maybe something new that you've learned, but to actually take a moment to process it. So I'm actually going to give you a little bit of time here to write down some of the key things that you've taken away from the discussion so far. Okay, so hopefully you've been able to jot some things down. And you have a little bit of a reminder now of some of the things that we've talked about so far. Why do I do this? I do this even when I have a very short time to present and to share information in, because it is what happens when we're doing this is we are reactivating, we're rehearsing, we're holding that information in working memory, we're practicing it again, and the likelihood is much greater that it's going to end up being remembered. So we want to activate and then reactivate those neural networks that were formed during that learning experience. So now I want to explore another area of memory. And this, I hope, will provide some insights into some of the issues that occur when we ask students to remember things, or when we ask ourselves to remember things. So this is a little experiment. And what I want you to do now is, if everybody can get a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil, something to write with. And I'm going to share a list of words with you. And then I'm going to give you a chance to learn them. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share the words now. So you can see the list here. And I'm going to give you a little bit of time to study the list. And then we're going to take it away, and we're going to try to remember as many as you can. So study the list, and we're going to see how many you can remember. Okay, so that's not very much time. So if you need a little more time and you're watching this as a recording, you can pause it. Might be cheating a little bit, but that's okay with me. So now I'm going to take it away. And I would like you to write down as many of those words on the list as you can remember. You don't have to type it in the chat window. You can just write it on your own. Usually everybody is sort of madly writing, trying to remember those words as quickly as they can. Hopefully you're remembering some of them. Okay, so big question. How many words did you get? Oh, I have to go back and show you the list, don't I? All right. Oh, no, I just don't. How many words did you get? I won't show you the list yet. $15. Oh, very impressive. 10. Excellent. Okay, so this is a group with very good memory skills. Now I have one other question for you. And that question is, did you write down the word sweet? Anybody write down the word sweet? No. Okay, Judy, no. Typically, most of the people actually do write down the word sweet, even though the word sweet, and here's the list again, was not on the list. But all of these words center around our neural networks for that concept of sweetness. And so we can remember, and we think we remember, that the word sweet was on the list. And you can do this with a lot of other types of, you can have a list of words that include nap and bed and drowsy and things like that, and induce people to remember the word sleep, even though it wasn't on the list. And so it's sort of fascinating to think that we can, what we're doing when we're activating these neural networks is we're activating a whole bunch of stuff. And so that may be something that we actually remember or something that we don't. There's a lot of work that's going on now in the justice system about the validity of recall of eyewitness testimony. Because as you can see, every time we reactivate these networks, we can change them a little bit. And so we may remember that we heard the word sweet when we didn't hear the word sweet whatsoever. Well, Judy, if you had gotten them all right, Judy says she didn't get them all right. If you had gotten them all right, we're going to sign you up for one of those photographic memory clubs. Okay, so I wanted, as we're doing this, I would love for you to share your own thoughts as well. But, why is all of this important for teachers? All of this idea of how we form memories, how information gets in, how our brains build these neural networks. And it's important because as teachers and parents, we don't transmit knowledge and understanding to students. That paradigm of what the teacher does, which is share information or transmit knowledge, is simply wrong. It doesn't apply. It doesn't work. The only way for us to learn is for our brains to construct knowledge and understanding from the experiences that we have. And so when we think about what it means, and when I have to say that when I started off teaching many years ago, I taught foreign language. And I thought that my job was to get the stuff that was in my head into my students' head. Now I know differently. And what my job really was to create the environment and the learning experiences that would help their brains build that network and learn the language themselves, or whatever the topic was. So every time that we create those experiences, we're actually helping our students physically change their brains. So what I'd like you to do now is to maybe elaborate on this. Maybe you have some other thoughts about why this might be important for teachers, or you could jot down a sentence that you might use to share this idea with a colleague. And I'm going to check the chat window to see what thoughts you might be willing to add to this, make this more of a conversation. And for those of you who are watching this as a recording and concerned about these empty spaces, I hope you will also be taking the time to think about it, to process, because that's going to reinforce these ideas. There's nothing going on when it's silent. It's important work that your brain is doing to help remember what it's being exposed to and what it's learning. Okay, so hopefully everybody has some takeaway thoughts about this. And now we have sort of a quiz. There's a one-question quiz, and it's multiple choice. So if I asked you, based on what you've been exposed to this afternoon, what the best way to learn and remember the information that I've been sharing with you, would you think that the best way is to go and re-listen to all of it by listening to the recording when it's available, or to just review the PowerPoint slides and go through them, or maybe not think about it for a while so that the information really has time to sink in, or to teach it to someone else? So what would you say? What would be the best way? Okay, Judy's on top of it. Deb's on top of it. Most of us who are teachers or in this field probably intuitively got this right, because the answer is to teach it to somebody else. When we have to teach it to somebody else, we have to reactivate those networks, and we have to put effort into the recall of the information. If we can't explain to somebody else, it isn't clear to us. So we really have to get that information in order. And once you start to teach it, it's going to be much harder for us to forget. So this is a wonderful example of the kind of information that for many teachers, and good teachers especially, is intuitive. So when we do PD, it's not always new information to teachers, but what it does is that it tells good teachers, helps them understand why the things work that they know work. It helps less experienced and less capable teachers sometimes change their practices. But when we understand why things work, then it helps us generalize it, and we have a lot more confidence in it when we're actually using these techniques. And often what we will do at this stage then is we will dive into a variety of instructional strategies and classroom practices that really build on this information. So we're not going to do that today. We're going to instead open this up for questions, which I welcome. And Karen, if you're there, you can help me with questions, or I'm going to go back and check our chat window again.
Covered most of them.
All right. You can also ask any questions you want about sort of brain myths and facts that you've heard that you're not sure of. And I know it's the end of a long day for many of us, so I'm going to be content with just the kinds of exchanges we've had. And if you have questions about this material, I certainly welcome them. Would love to continue the dialogue with anybody who would like it. I also want to mention that if you have know of a school that you think might be interested in learning, having their teachers learn more about the brain in a very interactive way. One of the things, hopefully, that became at least a little apparent here is that we put a lot of emphasis on practicing what we preach. So giving people time to reflect, giving people very hands-on kinds of experiences that will really give them the firsthand experience of getting those neural networks activated, reinforcing it, and getting people to share and reflect and to teach it to others. So all of our PD is therefore very, very hands-on, very interactive. In any event, if you know somebody who might be interested, we are already starting to book engagements for next year, the next school year, which starts in a frighteningly few number of months. So I just hope you will feel free to pass that on to them and to contact us if there is any interest. Here's my contact information. So once again, if you have any questions about the material that I shared with you this afternoon, or you would like a certificate of participation if you're watching the recording, or if you're interested in talking about working with your teachers, or anything else pretty much brain related, I would love to hear from you and love to connect with you. So I'm going to, Karen, I have one more chance. Any questions pop up right at the end?
Well, Judy said, I think working with the brain is hugely important and overlooked in traditional teaching.
Yeah. You know, it's teaching is starting to become more of a science. You know, it's been, as my dear friend Dr. Pat Wolf calls it, it's been a folklore profession for far too long. And when we know so much now about the science of learning, and we need to be careful about how we apply it. But the fact of the matter is, when we really understand, for example, that learning is a biological process, then we need to examine the kinds of activities and experiences that we expose our students to that are actually going to create those strong neural connections and help them with retrieval and recall. We need to make things relevant. We need to do all the kinds of things. And as we learn these, it becomes easier and easier to, whether it's reading instruction or math instruction or social studies or social emotional learning, whatever it is. All of this is when we inform it with sound neuroscience appropriately applied based on the research, we can become far more professional and far more effective in how we help our students learn. So thank you very much for that, Judy. I appreciate that. Okay, well, our time is up, and it's been a pleasure once again to have everybody here. We thank you very much for sharing your time with us. Time is the most precious thing we have, and we're really grateful for your spending a little bit of it with us this afternoon. We hope you have a great rest of the afternoon, and I hope to see you in another one of our webinars sometime soon. Take care and have a wonderful evening.